Thank you very much for having me, and Vicki, thank you for that nice introduction. It's kind of a mouthful, all those things. So I wanted to start out with why write about food or food story. And why did I gravitate toward that, I guess? And I didn't really intentionally start out to write about food. I write about culture and where cultures meet and the boundaries of cultures and maybe how we're alike in many ways and sometimes how we're different. And it seems like almost always food is a very good lens to show that story. And so I also had read some really wonderful writing by M.F.K. Fisher that inspired me because she was a writer, of course, during wartime, and she wrote about scarcity. And even though I've never lived that experience, I could see it through her words, and I felt I understood what it was like to try and feed a family at that time. And also just universal stories about all kinds of things. If you ever have a chance to read M.F.K. Fisher, I highly recommend it. So I'd like the next slide, please. So when I began to think about writing the foods of Missouri, because I feel like food comes from place. So when writers talk about place, it's land, right? It's soils, it's agriculture, it's what those things provide for our tables. And so when I began to think about the foods of Missouri, I thought about land and settlement. And so I found this map. Many of you may have seen this. It was American Agriculture in 1922. I thought it was a great map. It was published by Armour and Company, a meat packing firm. And it tries to show the principal agricultural products across the country at that time. And of course, records weren't that good then. So the map makers at the time admitted it may not have been completely accurate and they couldn't have fit everything within each state border. And they wrote in a Vox magazine article, they said, quote, it has been impossible to locate with geographical accuracy within state lines all the principal products of some of the states. Nonetheless, the principal products of each state are indicated and the geographical location of the principal products and the divisions of the United States have been affected with a fair degree of accuracy. But I think the broad message of the map is at the very top. And it says, America's strength as a nation was substantially derived from its strength as an agricultural power. That's pretty much the message. That huge expanse of our country, and you can see it there, allowed for a vast number of climates and allowed us to have a much more diverse set of crops and raise many more animals than most other nations. And Armour and Company says in the Vox article, the United States is the most self-sustaining nation in the world. Okay, change the slide. So here's a close-up of Missouri, and you can see the crops in 1922, or the products: cattle, swine, sheep, corn, wheat, oats, rye, barley, apples, pears, peaches, poultry. Next slide. And then today, these are the top products produced and consumed in the state. And the next slide. But if you think about it, why was it those products? And you might say it's what our land supports, but who settled the area also had a large impact. Next slide. So over the past 8 years, I've been teaching in the Science and Agricultural Journalism program at MU. And every semester, I would start my main class, asking each student about their food community of origin. So, it could be one community, you grew up in one place, it could be several if you moved around. I asked them to describe it to me in sensory terms. So what was the texture of the table like in your mom's kitchen? What was the view through the window by the stove? What was the primary aroma in the air? Or was there somebody that always sat down and said the same darn thing every Sunday? What was the sensory details that if you hear that bit of music or you smell that particular aroma, you're instantly transported into your mom's or family's kitchen? So for instance, and I always ask them to start their sentences by saying, I am from. So in my case, I might say, I am from a community that on Thursday nights, the families put together a spaghetti supper for the football players and their families at the middle school. And I might talk about how the plastic trays sounded as they scraped along the metal counter, and how the spaghetti might have sounded when it hit the tray, or how when you walked on the linoleum floor, it was just slightly gritty in certain spots, maybe by the doors. Or when everybody started talking, the fathers and the younger siblings, it got so loud in there because of the echoes. And that would tell you something about my small town in Missouri. But I would also say my food community, I am from a land of 1,000 spices and 4 o'clock tea that's milky and sweet, and that you always dunk slightly coconut flavored biscuits into. And how I would always drink my tea to the bottom until there was mush at the bottom, and take a little tiny metal spoon and scrape that mush out, and that sound against the porcelain. And that would be my story, because it's more than one food community of origin. And I mention all this to you now because I'd like you, to think about what your food community of origin is. And a little bit later in this talk, I'm gonna hopefully get some feedback from you on some of those things. So it was always fascinating to me in my classes that we got to know each other far more deeply with that short exercise. We'd go around the table, and it might take 2 or 3 minutes for each student. It wasn't lengthy. But we got to know each other far more deeply than just going around and saying our names, or even where we were from or what year in school everybody was. Because even if you look homogenous on the outside, under the surface, there's a lot of diversity. And usually Food Story can tell you what that diversity is and help you to understand it and maybe be interested in it. Okay, next slide. So the flavors of Missouri include a bountiful varieties of ingredients. And Madeline Matson, in the book Food in Missouri, A Cultural Stew, says Missouri food history shows our history. From the hunting and farming methods of this area's earliest inhabitants through the contributors of the state's substantial African-American population and more. So in other words, people try to recreate their comfort foods everywhere they go. And we want those foods, and we will do go to great lengths to grow and have them. And as I started driving through the eastern side of our state when researching Savor Missouri, I came across so much of what makes Missouri unique and interesting, and ultimately a delicious state to explore. And I couldn't help but see parallels to the work I have most recently completed in Africa, where agriculture and, in fact, the roads are still developing. Next slide. So as I drove through Missouri, I thought about how what we eat today was profoundly affected by the advances in farming methods, the invention of the electric range, cookbooks, both of which I feel are artifacts of women's lives, and waves of immigration, just as it is anywhere in the world. So it's kind of interesting to me that foods of our region of this country is kind of synonymous with what we think of as, Thanksgiving. It's turkey, it's wild rice, it's apple pie, it might be cranberry sauce. It's kind of the stereotype of what is America. But there's clues to look for tracing our region's food story is also in the history of the food preparation, in the preservation. Again, I think are both primarily women's histories, and markets. If you take a look at your plate and think about the foods that the following groups might have brought there. So indigenous peoples, if you think about the mound people, we call them, near St. Louis and the Mississippi River, and even on the farm that my family lives on today, the Missouri Oto Indians had that land for hundreds of years. I sit in my kitchen with my modern stove and my countertop, and I don't know how they live their lives, primarily because I don't know how they cooked. If it rains and if the streams flood and then they recede. I can walk along those streams on our farm, and I'll find arrowheads, and I'll find scraping tools, and all kinds of evidence of that they lived full lives right there on our land. But I don't know them because I have lost their food story. I don't know how to make acorn flour. I don't make the foods they made. And I feel like that's a world heritage loss when we lose the food story of a people, because we lose them. The French, Saint Genevieve in 1750, 23 full-time residents. It took a while for that to grow because they settled in a muddy flat and nobody wanted to live there. The Spanish, and even though by the 1790s we were returned to France, the Spanish had an influence. Southerners, or Americans from the South, who poured into our territory from 1804 to 1821 because of Indian land and titles that were extinguished. There's an abundance of high-quality land, inexpensive, and the wave of settlers soon overwhelmed the French-speaking people. And the young farmers who came made a good living with Missouri woodlands by grazing cattle. And think about how this set a pattern for our landscape well into the 21st century. The slaves, this population peaked in 1830, I think about 18%, and dropped down to 9 to 10% by 1860. The Underground Railroad kept people moving through the state. Irish and Germans in the 1840s, the heavy immigration, as likely many of you know. In the late 1880s, we had Italians coming in. All of those waves of immigration made a profound impact on what we have on our plates. Next slide. So the foods from other lands and food and identity in Missouri. So when I was mentioned that I sometimes freelance for other publications, and I had done a story for Feast magazine a few years ago called The Secret Fig Society, because I love figs. So I got really interested in figs because I'd heard there's a lot of figs in St. Louis, and I live in central Missouri. I'd never seen a fig tree. I didn't know how that could be. So I started calling St. Louis people that I knew, and there's a Monsignor who, with a parish in central St. Louis, who had a beautiful fig tree. It took me a few weeks because I kept calling and leaving messages, and I finally reached him, and he said, "Why do you want to know about my fig tree?" And I thought, well, that's an interesting question. And then as I was calling him, I was also calling, I'd heard about a man who they called the Fig Man, because he kept coming to the farmers markets, and he would sell figs and sell them out every day that he came. So Ivan Stolioff, and he owns Ivan's Fig Farm in Dittmer, Missouri. And so I kept trying to call Ivan. It's like, where did you get these figs? How do they live in Missouri? I want a fig. Basically, I want a fig tree in my farm in central Missouri. And how can that be? And I couldn't get a hold of Ivan either. He wouldn't return my calls. I tried again. And then when I finally reached him, he has an Eastern European accent, which I can't pronounce. If I could, it would make this so much more effective. He says, "Why do you want to know about my figs?" And I was taken aback. I said, "Well, I like figs. That's why I want to know." But it's like, that's why I called the story The Secret Fig Society. I think foods that mean a lot to us, we hold close to the vest sometimes, right? Most of the fig trees in St. Louis came in with the Italian immigrants. Ivan is from Eastern Europe. He came in later. He has different varieties of figs that he sells. And I did get a fig sapling, and I grow figs on our farm. So other things like corn, squash, and beans came from the Native Americans. Barbecue sauces from the Spanish, maybe potatoes, and sausages from the Germans love to make into delicious foods. Italian flavors in the figs that I mentioned. Many other dishes like the Italian sausage in the hills, Milanese and Sicilian immigrants came up with all kinds of yummy foods, toasted ravioli, St. Louis style pizza that uses Provel cheese instead of mozzarella, Kansas City barbecue. It is literally everywhere around this state. Next slide. So if you're a writer like me, you want to bring your readers to where they are in the story, for that story to be resonant in any way. So I feel that you can do this by using food to pinpoint history and place. And if you want to start with this, you are here. How do you tell people where they are? There's a quote by Kevin Corain in The Art of Fact that says you want to do this by making facts dance. And I think food is one of those things that we all sort of get happy when we talk about food. It makes facts dance. We pay attention. We want to connect. If as a writer, I want to connect readers to people, culture, and land, I feel like it's a wonderful lens to do that. So what I do is I try and see the story through the lens of food and landscape, and I focus on that through the use of human senses. So as an example, I want you to come with me right now to a mythical land. Next slide. Yes, it's Kansas. If you're map people, you'll notice that's Kansas. And if you're really good map people, you'll notice if you look in the southeast corner where I'm from, Pittsburgh, Kansas is a little dot on that map. And that might tell you something. You might understand what that means. But if I show you that picture of the sunflowers and the flat field and the beautiful open sky with those lovely clouds, that might tell you a little more. Next slide. But if I really wanted you to understand where I'm from, I might show you this plate. If you know anything about Southeast Kansas, you might know we have chicken wars down there. And Chicken Annie's and Chicken Mary's, 300 yards apart on a county highway, you have to eat there. You have to go. Sometime when you all are taking trips around, go to Chicken Annie's or Chicken Mary's. So if you go to Chicken Annie's or Chicken Mary's and you order a standard chicken lunch or dinner, what's going to come on that plate is kind of what you see here. You'll see the fried chicken because we're just a little bit southern there. You'll see the potato salad and coleslaw, and by the way, that's German potato salad with vinegar, and the slaw is also made with vinegar. It's not sweet because there's a lot of Balkans descendants that came to our area. And obviously, whoever ordered this plate was not from there because they have baked beans. That's not what you would get. Let's change the slide, and this is what you would get standard. Yes, spaghetti, because who else settled our area was Italians. We had a lot of strip mining in the area, and we had a lot of Italian settlement for that kind of work. But if you just take it one step further, think about this. All of those foods were on one plate. They were served at one restaurant. All of those communities were together eating together. They didn't mind that their foods were touching each other on the plate. They had a community of these mixed origins, and they got along. And I think that tells you the story of Southeast Kansas pretty clearly, if you just take the time to look at what's on the plate. Okay, next slide. So, what I was remember when I asked about your food communities of origin, I was kind of hoping there'd be a few brave souls in this audience that might talk about, just for a minute, if you could think of an iconic dish that represents your family or your community, or some aroma or some method of cooking. Oops, I think we really jumped to the end there. That's okay, that'll work. It was me and my organization of slides. But so does anybody have any foods you can tell me about? What represents your mom or your grandma or your father? Yes, Vicki.
When I grew up at home, every Friday night was French fried shrimp, and Saturday was chili. And of course, every day, 6 o'clock meal together with the family.
Shrimp and chili on the next day. Yeah. And what were the reasons that shrimp was chosen?
I never asked the question.
So that might be a great question for any of your elders still in the family.
Anybody I can ask.
Anybody else?
And it was the only thing that I knew how to cook when I got married.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, think about all the meals you had that. And everybody is around the table, right? And they're having that same dish on the weekends. What else? Yes.
My grandmother kept a dusty tin can of sorghum underneath the sink. And whenever you went to visit my grandma, she would get that out, she'd dust it off a little, she'd open that up, and we would all eat out of this tin can of sorghum, and you put it on everything.
Like, what kinds of things did you put it on?
Biscuits or just an old piece of bread, but that was a little treat that my grandma would often serve.
Was she on a farm, or did she?
Well, she lived in southeast Missouri.
Yeah, so sorghum.
Sorghum.
Yeah,
That plays into mine.
yeah,
My grandma's famous molasses cookies.
molasses cookies,
Because baking is how you show love.
absolutely.
And after she passed, I got a handwritten copy of her recipe, which is one amazing that she wrote down. But when I read it, I cried because it showed me why she valued my education. She didn't get to finish grade school, and I don't think she even got a day in high school because she had to quit and take care of her brother and sisters. So cinnamon is cinnamon. It is spelled the way it sounded to her German ears.
Yeah,
So that's eating molasses cookies now for my sisters and me is a religious experience.
absolutely. Well, and it's so interesting because I really think those recipes and cookbooks are artifacts of women's lives. It really opens up an entire world that wouldn't be there without those little notes and without the reasons certain recipes were collected. I really think that when I look at my family's recipes, and it sounds like for you as well, it's like it's showing the identity of my family. You know, so and so really doesn't like sugar in this, and so for so and so we're going to put peas in this, and you know, it's just it really pinpoints who we are, and it's a wonderful record. Anybody else? Yes.
Home cured ham.
Home cured.
Cured and smoked.
Home cured and smoked ham. Who did that?
My grandfather, and goodness knows how many generations before that.
Right.
But they all had pigs, they all had smokehouses.
Where did they come from originally?
Let's see, originally Germany.
Germany.
Most settled in the Missouri Valley, and most of the kinfolk are there yet.
Yeah. And those traditions probably came with them, right? And so that was a way of tying the foods of comfort and what their tastes were to their new location. And it carries on. I don't know, do you smoke hams?
I wish I knew now. It's one of those things that if I could call Grandpa back right now, that's one of the things
Absolutely.
to show him.
Right. Yeah, I know. Anybody else? I'd love to hear. I really, really enjoy this. So if anybody has any stories, I'd love to hear them. Yes.
When Grandma visited, there was homemade pea and spatzle soup, and you never had a recipe to go by. So if you ask her how you do it, it's a pinch of this and a little drop of that, and then you wait for it to get to look like this.
Yeah. And spatzle. I mean that's something that people don't take the time to make anymore. You can find it in specialty groceries, but wow, what a treat. Yes. Spatzle. Like a noodle, like a dumpling, kind of. Yeah.
The best cook in my family was my grandma Dickon. She never followed a recipe. The thing that I think about most about her though was her black walnut fruitcake that she made for Thanksgiving that was totally inedible. That it was awful. I mean, it was absolutely awful, and everybody raved over it. Everything else she ever made was fabulous.
Well, what an interesting mix.
Failure. And she actually cooked it in a dish pan. So there was tons of it. That's
Fail.
the food that I remember most, even though that she was a spectacular cook. Her failure is what I remember.
And where's your family background?
Southwest Arkansas for that brand.
For that brand. Well, it's just interesting because black walnuts are very specific to our region. There aren't black walnut trees anywhere else in the world. So mixing that with an old recipe of fruitcake is interesting. I think that's fascinating. Well, I remember when I was writing the book up here, Biting Through the Skin, gave me an opportunity to speak with people in the family, you know, who don't normally, I'm thinking of my father, normally talk about his childhood at all. And so, you know, what was your childhood like? You know, there was no silence for that. But if I said, what did your mother fix you for Saturday morning breakfast? He could tell me all kinds of things. And so I learned so much more about people who I care about by asking those kinds of questions. And if many of you may be the person that is the storehouse for those stories now. So tell people in your family. You'd be surprised what of an impact it might have on people. And my mother was one who never measures anything. So when I was trying to write the recipes for that book, and I learned from her, so I never measured either. I had to actually, she would cup a spice in her hand. You guys have all seen women or men do this, and yeah, that's about right, So I would then go in with my metal measuring spoons and try and measure. Yeah, so it was always interesting because you're trying to equate this aroma in the air to what's coming out of a metal measuring cup or spoon, and that's kind of an interesting process. Anybody else? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Well, those are the stories. Stories like that is what I was looking for when I was going out to write Savor Missouri. And I took a look, just to give you an idea of the process, I took a look at a map, and I looked, of course you notice the rivers in Missouri right away, and I thought, well I want to focus on the river hills areas of Missouri, because it's, think about where most of our settlements started. It's also how foods and goods moved, not only down the river, but food trails came up the river. So if you think about the settlements along the river, they've got a really interesting mix of food cultures going on. So I started with that, and then picking communities, I would call the Chamber of Commerce. I would find a restaurant that I'd heard about. I'd call the owner, I'd talk to them a little bit, and I'd ask them where they went when they wanted to eat something really good or buy some really great vegetable or fruit. And then I would do that. I would call the person that they mentioned, and I would call a lot of people. And if four or five names kept getting repeated, those are the 4 or 5 names I thought were worth going to a visit. And then I would visit them and talk to them. And then if they were they'd been around for a while, I thought they would be around for a while, they were interested in the public, they had an interest in talking about their story, then they more than likely ended up in the book. So I guess I tell you all of that because it wasn't a scientific, it was much more an organic approach. And I also judged how I felt when I was there, because I didn't want to send readers to places that wouldn't be a great experience. So I can tell you, everywhere in Missouri, it was a very warm and welcoming experience, and so those 70 plus people were in the book. So on the road doing interviews for Savor Missouri, I realized very quickly how beautiful our state is. And I'd always known that Missouri's a pretty place, but it really came home to me as I was driving the back roads and making turns off the main highways to small communities and finding farms and orchards. I was driving through the rolling hills, near the Mark Twain National Forest, and what is that? 1.5 million acres of trees, beautiful, right? I passed several homes along the highway between Rolla and Cape Girardeau, and I'm driving. I'm noticing these gorgeous trees, these wonderful, I love clouds, so cumulus clouds and birds banking in the air and, landscapes that included waterways. And I'm looking at all of this. There's no traffic, so I'm not a danger to anybody. And I'm driving, and I noticed this house on my left, and it has this unusual door, and I looked a little closer, and it looks like a barn wall. And the house had actually been built around this barn wall. Instead of tearing down the barn wall, they had left it. And they'd also found a hoe, and they'd put it diagonally across the wall as decoration, so it was like farm debris was their whole choice. And I thought, this is interesting. It's decisions like that that really intrigue me. Missouri is a place where the people really make an impression, right? Since publication of this book, some of the folks in the book have aged out of the work that they were featured doing, but the profiles still give you this snapshot of Missouri and our story here. I went to places like the Setter Walls, I was going to say county, but it's country pastry shop outside of Hannibal. And here is Velma and her husband, Howard, and they have 2 huge balls of dough in their hand. And both of them are talking to me, and they're both kneading the dough in their hand at the same time. And I got a sense of how their work has synchronized over years, 40 years of doing this together. Every day they make pastries and breads, and they take it to Colony Flea Market, and they sell them on Thursday and Friday, and they bake Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Every day, every week. And, you know, I went in their place and they had tables that Howard had made years before, very thick wood plank top tables and big rolling pins. And I picked up a rolling pin immediately. I had to use two hands, it was so heavy. These are people who really love what they do, very passionate about what they do. And if you're at their farm and you walk between their house and the place that they bake, you see something unusual. There's like cooing noises and feathers flapping, and out of the side of your eye you'll see teal and bright blue flashes of feathers. And what turns out is that the Sutterwalls have a second passion. They really like birds, and they have partridge, they have pheasants, doves, mountain quail, feral quail, they have peacocks. So as you walk, you suddenly have this realization, these people decided to have their life revolve around two unusual things. Well, kind of unusual, bread and birds. I mean, that's an unusual combination. We had at Meyer Horseshoe Pines in Jackson, the family planted spruce and Scotch, white and Virginia pines, and because of an old harness collection, very small thing that somebody had uncovered in a back room, they decided they were going to raise Belgian draft horses. So if you go to their farm, you can, they also raise sheep, so you can order lamb, you can ride in a horse-drawn buggy and go to the back part of the farm and pick up a Christmas tree. You can come back and you can visit a Christmas shop that one of the women has put together. At Woods Smoke Meats in Bowling Green, Ed and Regina have more than 550 awards for their meats. And they're full evidence all around. And it's also in the taste of their products. It's just absolutely delicious. But on the wall in this utilitarian office, it's full of, notes from phone conversations, receipts, and orders. But there's this map and this bright red pushpin in Turkmenistan on the wall. And it turns out Ed had gone to Turkmenistan for 30 days. He lost 25 pounds, but he taught a meat smoking workshop, and he got hooked on service. At County Line Farm in between Perry and St. Genevieve, Trapper and Clyde Brookeroff have the best vegetables I've ever had, and Trapper will show you all kinds of tubers, like all varieties of tubers. There's the potatoes that he really loves, and Clyde, the tomatoes, he knows all the names. He cultivates squash as well, and there's long bunches of corn stalks around there, the stand where they check out people. But if you just look around it, you'll see this beautiful old tractor, a 1958 Oliver tractor that he lovingly painted, and it's a relic from his dad's farm on the same land. At Buckridge Farm, peaches near Herman, you can buy really amazing peaches out of the back of a truck in the parking lot at the lumber store. Tim Wright and Larry Buck started working together as teenagers, and they now have this beautiful hilltop farm. It used to be a vineyard that they, and I mean hilltop, you have to have four-wheel drive to get up there, you won't make it. And they know their peaches. They have them coming off the trees in waves from different varieties through mid-summer to late summer. It's another company that really knows their products. At Sassafras Valley Farm in Morrison, Connie Cunningham is another Missourian who knows her product, is passionate about it, and lives to tell about it on her farm near Morrison. In this county filled with corn and beef producers, she's known as the Goose Lady because she raises German emblem, I can never say that word, in French Toulouse geese, just as settlers did there generations ago. She added duck to her mix of products and sells all over the internet, all over the country, to those wanting traditional holiday feasts. So all of these people and 70 others or a little more gave me their time as I explored the state for the book. It was truly an outstanding experience. And the gems of the state, in addition to the regional food flavor, and our wines are its people. It's always fun to meet people who are passionate about what they do, and it seems to be the connecting factor in all the farms, restaurants, specialty meat shops, cheesemakers, orchards, everything that's in the book, that's the connecting factor. They're all passionate about what they do. And there's 70 recipes in the book from these same producers. If you really want to see a variety of Missouri flavor, that'll do it. I hope that, I guess the end of my story is that I hope you'll get out and explore the state, if you haven't already, and probably get off those main highways and really see it, because it's an amazing place, and it's got such a variety of landscapes that you're never going to get bored. I'll say that. So that's kind of what I want to talk about with Savor Missouri. The other things that I'm involved with are always related to food and culture. So I've just returned from Mozambique, where I did the low literacy cookbook for smallholder farmers, and I'm headed off on Sunday morning to India to do my next book on green chili and other imposters. I'm just fascinated by seeing the history of people and their land through the foods that they produce, and I'm hoping that when you next go to someone's home that you really like, or your own loved ones, look down and see what they're producing, putting on that plate, and what stories are around that. Ask those questions, because what I found is that sometimes you don't think of those things until they've passed, and then you cannot ask those questions any longer, and it's a loss.